Hello and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Adrian Finighan. The Syrian National Coalition is meeting in the Turkish city of Istanbul to decide whether to attend peace talks in Switzerland, which are due to take place in a few days. Meanwhile, the US Secretary of State has urged all sides to attend next week's talks, which are aimed at ending the conflict in Syria. But the Syrian government and the opposition Syrian National Coalition don't seem to agree on the agenda. The major sticking point between the two sides is whether the talks should lead to a transitional government. Let's take you now to Istanbul. Al Jazeera's Anita McNaught has been monitoring those talks, and she joins us now from there. Anita, why has it proved so hard for the Syrian opposition to take a decision on whether to attend these talks in Geneva?
Well, it's not because they don't care about these Geneva talks. It's not because they don't think they're important. In fact, the opposite is probably true. They are symbolically and practically far too important. And it's the nature of their entry into these talks that is proving so hard for them to agree on. There's a group in the Syrian National Coalition who have felt for a long time that the necessary international support and backing, the sort of preconditions, if you like, but the sort of understanding that exists on the ground ahead of these talks, namely that they will lead to an acknowledgement and implementation of Geneva I, principally the transitional government, and that is what the talks are meant to be about. They don't feel that the international community is really signed on for that anymore. They just want the talks to take place at any cost, and they feel that isn't the way they should proceed into these talks. There's another group that feels that whether or not they can guarantee this, they need to be sitting around a table anyway. That kind of matches the international view, as we're hearing from various parties commenting outside. But they have so much credibility at stake here, the Syrian coalition. If they don't go, they have to have a very good reason for not going. And they also have some procedural problems. There's actually an article in the constitution of the Syrian National Coalition that says they are not allowed to negotiate with the Assad regime. But what in effect they are doing, if they go to Geneva, is doing that. So they have issues structurally within themselves. They need to take a vote or decide that this constitutional, this article in the Constitution isn't significant enough to spike the talks in its own right. And then, of course, they have the issue of numbers. They want a convincing majority of participants in the Syrian National Coalition, delegates, to decide to go if that's what they do. They can't take a rump of independence to a meeting in Switzerland and then claim to represent the broad majority of the Syrian people. So for all these reasons, they are enormously troubled by the decision they're trying to make, and they're trying to make it with as much support and as much inclusivity and with as much consultation as they can manage. But consultation is taken time, and perhaps came too late.
Give us a sense of what's going on behind the scenes then. Who else is helping to facilitate this decision-making? Who else has been consulted in this process?
It's been very interesting watching this. The international diplomatic community, as represented in Istanbul, has been hovering around the fringes of this meeting. I wouldn't say they're anxious, but they are concerned. There is an almost unanimous view among international diplomats that the Syrian, the meeting in Geneva has to take place, that people at least have to sit around a table and start a process. No one's saying it's going to lead to peace talks. This is a process that could take years, but it has to start somewhere. And they're saying, and they're applying pressure wherever they can get in, they're saying you have to begin the process, you have to show you're serious. And the delegates here hear that. No one wants to be the person who says no to something that could be the beginnings of a peace process. That makes everyone look bad, but it also makes the international community look impotent if they can't persuade the Syrian opposition to participate. So they're working. And then we found out that there's also another track, and it's a military track, and it's a fairly essential track too. In Ankara, and that's been going on for a few days, there have been talks involving some of the leaders of the more moderate military groups. We don't have a complete list because we suspect some of them don't want to be known they're participants but feel they can't stay away. The point is that, as we all know, there's a disconnect between the political opposition in exile and the people who are actually fighting on the ground. And if something is agreed, be it the admission of aid convoys or some kind of a ceasefire, anything that involves maneuvers on the ground, passage on the ground, then the actors on the ground have to agree to it. If the Syrian National Coalition can't get the military groups to sign on to an agreement, then anything that's decided in Switzerland or among the coalition groups is itself a waste of time. So in Ankara have been participatory discussions with the fighting groups to try and find out what they will and won't agree to, or whether they will choose not to comment, to stay neutral, to say nothing, just to allow some kind of negotiated process to begin.
Anita McNaught in Istanbul, many thanks indeed. Well, the Syrian regime appears to be giving some ground, at least diplomatically. In a news conference held in Moscow on Friday, Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallem said that his government supports the international peace conference known as Geneva II. He's also said that he's given Russia, Syria's biggest ally, plans for a ceasefire in Aleppo, where fighting has been raging for months. Muallem went on to suggest that the regime would be interested in a prisoner swap if the rebels cooperate. Let's hear what Walid Muallem and his Russian counterpart both had to say.
Taking into account the role of the Russian Federation in ending the bloodshed in Syria, as well as our trustworthy relations, I have handed Minister Lavrov today a plan of security measures in Aleppo. In that regard, I asked Minister Lavrov to use his contacts to implement this plan and to establish a specific time when all military actions in this area should be ceased. I also informed Minister Lavrov about our fundamental position to agree to an exchange of prisoners in Syrian prisons with those captured by the other side. In that regard, we are ready to exchange the lists and to work out an arrangement about how to achieve all of that.
We want the upcoming conference to put an end to the bloodshed and ensure that Syria does not become a hotbed of terrorism. We hope that an agreement will be reached whereby peace is established and all ethnic groups in the country have equal rights.
Well, to discuss the prospects for future peace in war-torn Syria, we're joined by our three guests today. From London, Ammar Waqqaf, a Syrian political activist who's supportive of the Syrian government. From Oklahoma, we're joined by Joshua Landis, director of the Centre for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Radwan Ziadeh, director of the Syrian Centre for Political and Strategic Studies. Mr. Ziadeh is also the head of the Syrian Commission for Transitional Justice. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Radwan Ziadeh, is there any point in going ahead with these Geneva II talks, given that the opposition is in such disarray at the moment? Wouldn't it be better to concentrate on uniting the opposition before trying to mount peace talks?
First, let's say, of course, it's a difficult situation for not only for the opposition, but for Syria as a nation. Within the Assad delegation, it's a dictatorship. It's easy to take the decision to go to Geneva, even there is no consultation within the parliament of the Assad government. But within it's when you have a popular uprising, popular revolution, and everyone need to take part, and everyone actually has conditions, it's very difficult to compromise every voice within the Syrian revolution or within, and this is the difficulties of the Syrian opposition to take a decision to go to Geneva or not. I'm in favor of going to Geneva, but because I see it's many advantages of the Syrian opposition to go to Geneva and to put the case there and to put actually the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Assad government and seek for, as a priority, forming transitional governing body which governs Syria in that transition to lead Syria into democratic process. But otherwise, other groups within the opposition, they see that accepting negotiating with the Assad, it's a red line, and we should not do that.
All right.
And this is the negotiations between the both blocs, the both groups. It can take for some time.
Joshua Landis, given what's going on the ground in Syria, is diplomacy even relevant at this point?
Well, I think diplomacy is very important, even though there is considerable chaos. But the world has to, and particularly the leading European powers, have to push all of the international community together to begin to make deep compromises on every side. It's quite clear that the ambitions of the beginning of this revolution, which was to overturn the Syrian government and to set up some kind of democratic regime in Syria have been frustrated. And not only was the revolution not powerful enough to overturn Assad because he turned the guns of the military against it, the military did not divide from the president as it had in Egypt or throughout North Africa. And this turned it into a bloody war. And then the international community would not step up. The United States would not destroy Assad or his military as they did to Gaddafi and his military in Libya. And this has left the rebel forces in Syria in a very difficult position. Today, the world is trying to climb down from the initial euphoria of the revolution, in which the US president said Assad has to go, in which the world believed that Assad would fall within a matter of months. Today, they're trying to get the two sides to negotiate. And this is a very difficult thing, but in a sense, it's necessary if the refugee problem is going to be stanched, if some security is to be brought back to the millions of Syrians who are suffering.
Ammar Waqqaf in London. Is the Syrian government sincere in its desire to reach a negotiated settlement? What are we to make of the skepticism over the talk of a government readiness for humanitarian gestures, which some people argue is aimed more at winning goodwill and securing a tactical advantage rather than at indicating any genuine readiness to negotiate concessions with the opposition?
Well, you know, with regards to the offerings that are taking place in terms of ceasefire, for example, or exchange of prisoners and what have you, I think these are only designed to show goodwill. The real position of the Syrian government can be probably known better from the nature of the delegation that is being sent to Geneva. My understanding from the leaked list of personnel that are going is that this is mainly formed of Foreign Affairs Ministry personnel, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, his deputy, Mr. Bashar Jafari in New York, Dr. Buthayna Shaban and what have you. There is also the Minister of Information. But this mainly tells you who the Syrian government thinks they will be sitting with and what they think they will be talking about. It's foreign affairs. We haven't seen, for example, someone in the security or a representative of the security forces or the armed forces or the Ministry of Interior in the delegation. So they're not expecting to sit with opposition people or representatives in order to discuss the future of Syria as a country. You haven't seen representatives of the Ba'ath Party, the ruling party, for example. Sorry. So no political negotiations about Syria. This is clearly, from the Syrian point of view or Syrian government's point of view, a sort of regional or international affair. There is a bit of reason behind that, is that the opposition themselves have failed, one might argue as well miserably, in order to put the case for themselves as real representatives of the people on the ground who are disenchanted with the government, who have a mandate. So A, representation, and B, a mandate to negotiate with the Syrian government. And this, I think, goes right deep into the heart of the discussions that are taking place in Istanbul at the moment, because some people might fear, that if we go to Geneva as opposition figures and we don't achieve anything, we will lose every single bit of or shred of representation that we think we might have. This is because the Syrian opposition have positioned themselves, the political ones, I need to specify, have positioned themselves from the very beginning as, trying to go behind the revolution, behind the people, instead of leading them. So they look probably at what is happening in Geneva and what they might want to achieve from Geneva as a step forward in gaining legitimacy and mandate, not the other way around. But again, you cannot achieve something in Geneva unless you already have a mandate, which they seem not to have.
Well, let's put that to Radwan Ziadeh in Washington, D.C. The opposition has failed miserably. Who does the opposition in exile represent on the ground in Syria?
As I said before, this is a popular uprising and it's ideologyless and leaderless. no one can actually claim that he is leading the revolution. And this is why it's the difficulties in every popular uprising, in every popular revolution. Everyone feels that he is a leader, and this is the situations among the opposition, not only in Syria, in other countries, in Egypt and in Tunisia before. But the most difficult position here, that's when you have, because under 40 years of dictatorship of the Assad government, of the Assad dynasty, in his father and his successor, his son, there is no an classical democratic opposition. There is no opposition at all. All of them in exile, or all of them in prison. This is why it's difficult now to ask about organized opposition. And this is a just point of explanation how the things going on within the opposition. But within the Assad.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make the point that the opposition appears to be very much on the back foot at the moment in both political and military terms. Fighters on the ground are killing each other, and that's given the government forces an advantage, and the coalition, as we said before, appears to be in disarray. President Assad has the upper hand at the moment, doesn't he?
There is no infighting among the opposition, but the opposition now, the Free Syrian Army or the Arab opposition, fighting the Al-Qaeda link, the ISIS, which actually they are right now practical allies of the Assad government. The Arab opposition, the Free Syrian Army, lost more than 1,000 in the last 3 weeks in fighting against Al-Qaeda, where actually those groups, they are the Al-Qaeda group, they are actually practical ally to the Assad, and they are working in the same agenda. And this is see actually the Assad government never been targeted one of their buildings in Aleppo or in Al-Raqqa. And this is brought more difficulties for the Free Syrian Army, because it's fighting in two fronts, fighting the Assad government, the Assad militias, and fighting Al-Qaeda from other hand. With all of that into consideration, that's make it much more difficult for the opposition to make the case to the Free Syrian Army or to the armed opposition, what's the advantages if we can get anything if we decided to go to Geneva.
All right, well, let's see what Joshua Landis makes of what he's just heard there. And also, Joshua, is this, as John Kerry said this week, the best opportunity for the opposition to achieve the goals of the Syrian people and the revolution? If the opposition doesn't attend Geneva II, would it have lost its perhaps one and only chance to end the bloodshed and see the back of the Assad regime?
Well, there are just so many problems here. You know, if one looks at this quite cynically, the offers by the Syrian government of a ceasefire in Aleppo and a prisoner exchange, those two offers are designed, in a sense, to embarrass the Syrian opposition, because they don't actually control any prisoners and they don't control the troops on the ground in Aleppo. So it's impossible for them to negotiate either a ceasefire in Aleppo or a prisoner swap, because they're essentially politicians that live outside of the country. They are not militia commanders inside the country. Almost all of the militia commanders had said that they don't want anything to do with these negotiations. A few of the Free Syrian Army left have agreed to support the talks. But this is clearly what the regime is aiming to do, is to point out how powerless this political umbrella group, the Syrian opposition coalition, really is when it comes to negotiating. And that's why they've sent foreign ministry people and not people from the military. So this is the difficulty that we face today. The Syrian opposition still wants Assad to step down. And Assad has said he is going to discuss how to deal with terrorism. So both sides are going in order to try to get regime change on the other side. The Syrian opposition wants the United States to force Assad to negotiate to leave office, and the Syrians want the Russians and Americans to talk about how to arrest the Syrian opposition fighters on the ground. And you know, how do we bridge that gap? This is where diplomacy and John Kerry and Lavrov have a tremendous job ahead of them.
Ammar Waqqaf, I could see you nodding there. I mean, two questions. Has the Syrian opposition reached its expiry date? And the Saudis, Qataris and other Gulf states have been urged by the West to use their influence with the opposition to get them to attend the Geneva talks. To what extent are those nations and Iran the key to halting the violence and to finding this diplomatic solution?
Right, let me give you a little bit of the public perception vis-à-vis the nature of the opposition. The people who are disenchanted with the Syrian government, the Syrians who are disenchanted, who don't like, who want to see probably President Assad stepping down and what have you, change in the regime, do not perceive either the military faction, i.e. the commanders on the ground who have all this weaponry and might on the ground and influence, obviously, or the politicians who happen to be in Istanbul, in London, and so on, to be a unified body as partners, a military faction and a political faction who are both working to represent them and seek their interests, so on. They feel that both of these groups are controlled by the same pattern. This same pattern was, in the very beginning, probably the Qataris and the Turks more. Now it's clearly being the Saudis. They see that these groups do not talk to each other much, at least, you know, in front of cameras. But actually, in between them, there is a bit of, you know, a tug of war pulling on who has the say and who wants to represent. The issue is that the fighters on the ground believe that staying the course, staying true to what they believe the Syrian revolution, between quotation marks, is about, is important to keep the legitimacy of representation from the people. Whilst the politicians who happen to be in the position to have to meet with foreign politicians all the time, with ambassadors, and try to explain that they are capable of negotiating a deal and guaranteeing a deal, cannot really stay the course in terms of we're going to fight for the end of the world, and we're going to go until the end in order to bring down the regime. They need to show themselves as being able to strike a deal. And again, because they are unable to control things on the ground, if a politician from the opposition who happens to live in Istanbul picks up the phone and talks to a commander in Idlib or in Deir ez-Zor and tells them, as Joshua rightly said, are we going to free these people or not, that person might not even pick up the phone on the other end. Now, one thing that Mr. Ziadeh in Washington mentioned in terms of the opposition, and this is a popular uprising, okay. And they cannot,
Briefly, please.
You cannot. If we take, for example, the Egyptian model and the Tunisian model, these have been dictatorships as well for more than 30 years. Still, the opposition leaders are very much listened to by the population. Whilst in Syria, they seem to be talking on their own without the population really following them.
Right. Joshua Landis, finally, should these talks in Geneva go ahead at whatever cost, at any cost?
Well, if they fail today, it'll be very hard to resurrect them. And in part, this is not only about the players on the ground in Syria, it's about the international community, because there are deep differences in the international community. Saudi Arabia, Iran in particular, are diametrically opposed on what they want to see in Syria. And in many ways, the international community needs to bring together the sponsors of the different militias, the international sponsors, and try to get them to step down from their maximal objectives. Yeah. And that is the beginning of some kind of an agreement, and that can be done on this international level. Yes.
All right. Thank you. Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're out of time. Ammar Waqqaf in London, Joshua Landis in Oklahoma, and Radwan Ziadeh in Washington, D.C. And thank you for joining us on Inside Syria. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news bulletins and of course online at aljazeera.com. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. I'm Adrian Finighan in Doha. Bye for now.